Let me move this over out of the way. Okay, so more about fungi, part 2. I'm going to shrink this thing down. There we go. And as I mentioned last week, the information in this program, or at least quite a bit of it, is provided by Curtis Young, who is an extension educator for the Agriculture and Natural Resources Department for Van Wert County out to the west of us. And the photos are, some of them are mine, but a lot of them are taken from free stock available on Pinterest. And we are going to start with shelves and brackets, as I mentioned last week. And these were 2 of the first mushroom types we talked about last week. And there are some big differences about shelves and brackets. Now, first of all, I am going to drag these 2 fungi types into our world for comparison. Now, first of all, there is a big difference in these. Now, shelves, if you look at and think about shelves in our world, here's some shelves in a storage unit. Shelves are in there, and they're in our cupboards and so on, and they are pretty much self-supporting against the back of a cupboard or against a wall or so on. Everybody's familiar with that. Now, in some cases, like when shelves are built into a wall, you have brackets, these supports, right? You have these supporting structures called brackets. Get the picture, right? So with these fungi called shelves and brackets, you have that difference. With shelves on the left, there's no supporting structure. And with what these fungi we call brackets are, they have supporting structure either above or below, or in this case, both. Anybody have any questions on that? Clears it right up, right? So now the big question that I've alluded to, are all fungi mushrooms? What do you think? I want to hear some guesses.
I'm gonna guess not.
I think they are.
Anybody else? Okay, the answer is no. They are not. You know, scientists like to classify everything to death, right? And
Right.
this is no exception. Some fungi grow above the ground. Some fungi grow on the ground. If they grow above the ground, they are called conks. They are not mushrooms. So in the case of shelves and brackets, like these shelves that are shown here, they grow above the ground. They are called conks. They are not mushrooms. Mushrooms are the fungi that grow on the ground. They come up from the ground. They do not grow on logs. They do not grow on the side of trees. So they are either conks or they are mushrooms, even though they are all fungi. So that's a little bit confusing, but there is that differentiation. But the fun is not in there. To make it a little more confusing for you, because nothing's ever simple, right? If it's a shelf or a bracket, it's a conk, but guess what? It's also a polypore.
Hmm.
So a shelf or a bracket is a conk, but it's also a polypore. And does anybody remember from last week what a polypore means?
Multiple pores.
A polypore means it doesn't have gills like most mushrooms, which grow on the ground. No gills. It has the pores, which means it has the tubes. If you think back to last week, it doesn't have the gills. It has the thousands of tubes that hold the spores, which makes up for the difference of not having gills. So all of your conks, in other words, all of your shelves and brackets that grow on trees and on logs, none of them have gills. They all have pores, and therefore they are all called polypores. Poly meaning, of course, multiple. So multiple pore, polypores. Does that make sense? Is it complicated enough for you?
Makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. Okay, good. So now we are going to shift gears and move on to something else, part 2 of this. This is what an awful lot of people are consumed with and want to know about: finding the fungi. Especially people that are interested in the medicinal and culinary side of fungi. So you need to know, obviously, where and when they grow. That's the important thing. You need to know where and when they grow. Obviously, as we've seen, they grow on wood, they grow on soil. For some species, they grow on other fungi, which, as we mentioned last week, those are known as parasitic fungi, and we'll see an example of that. The recommended steps for identification, especially when hunting for culinary purposes, are, first of all, use an expert field guidebook. Spend the money, if you're going to do this, for a good field guidebook. Number 2, take your time in making IDs. Be very thorough in making IDs. You know, don't just have the guidebook in your backpack. Use it and use it to great detail. Number 3, try to work with people that are experienced in IDing. Either, you know, people whose acquaintance you make that have been doing this for a while, or use iNaturalist, which is a very good tool, or perhaps join something like the Ohio Mushroom Association, which is an organization of people who are very knowledgeable about this and are dedicated to hunting mushrooms for medicinal and culinary purposes, and are dedicated to sharing knowledge about, you know, what are the good mushrooms and the poisonous mushrooms and so on. And things that are important to key into are whether or not they have gills. What are the colors of the gill? Are they the same color as the cap or not? What's the color of the stem? What's the color of the cap? What is the size of the cap and the stem? The size of the veil? All of those things are important. And when it comes to the veil, what is the shape of the veil? And also, is the veil smooth? Is it wavy? Is it cogged? What is the growth pattern of the colony? These are all things that are in a guidebook, and the guidebook will explain why these things are important and why they need to be noted. Also, the host where they are found, meaning the type of ground or what type of a tree trunk they are growing on, what type of wood they are growing on, what type of soil they are growing in, or if they are growing on top of a host moss, for example. Whatever that host is, that can influence their growth. It can influence, even though it's a certain species, it can influence the color, the colony pattern, and it can also influence the taste. Even though it's a particular mushroom or fungi, it can influence the taste. It is also recommended, even if you think you have a very good ID on a fungi, to taste only small qualities first, especially if you are not completely sure of the ID. So those are really the basic things in terms of IDing fungi when it comes to hunting them for the culinary and medicinal purposes. It's a lot more detailed, and you have to be a lot more particular than if you were, say, hunting plants or herbs for those purposes. And then the other thing is that you have to learn is that some fungi only grow on certain hosts. And these are a few of them that we're going to look at here. Now, first of all, we'd mentioned parasitic fungi. This right here is something that is called spinellus fungi, these little shoots that you see here. That is spinellus fungi, and that is a parasitic fungi that grows on mushrooms. So you've got a fungi growing on a mushroom there. The mushroom itself may be edible, but that fungi is not. It's parasitic and it is poisonous. So usually anytime you see something that looks like spines like that, or looks like veils sprouting out from what looks like a normal mushroom, or hanging down like a veil or lace off of a normal looking mushroom, that's typically something that's parasitic, and they are typically poisonous. So this one, you've probably seen this. They're fairly large. It's called chicken of the woods. Chicken of the woods only grows on oaks, ash, or honey locust. Won't grow on anything else. And they're always this very bright, almost flowery looking. They're a very colorful fungi. And then it has a cousin hen of the woods,
Mhm.
which looks like this in the middle. These are dead leaves around it. These are not part of it, but this is hen of the woods. And hen of the woods grows only on old oak trees. Not just any old oak trees, but old ones. It typically only grows on oak trees that are like 100, 125 years or older. So ones that are pretty big around. It won't grow on newer ones. So it's very different looking from its cousin. Another one, this is Berkeley's polypore, and it looks kind of similar to the chicken of the woods. Its coloring is a little, the orange part of it is darker than chicken of the woods, and then the inside of it, the yellowish portion is actually a little lighter. This one only grows on oaks. It's not particular in terms of age, but it only grows on oaks.
Don, is this living or dead one?
This particular one is dead ones. This is ones that are, down timber. Oh, and I missed a line here. That one is also will grow on black locusts that are down. Now, the other thing is, and I alluded to this last week, most fungi only grow, their growing season is April to October in general. Although you will see from guidebooks that there are certain varieties that have short growing seasons. They're not as wide open as April to October, but that pretty much is the window in general there, April through October. You're not going to find pretty much, unless you have unseasonably warm weather, you're not going to find any in March, and you're not going to find any in November. One example of a short window is, as I showed you a picture of last week, the stinkhorns. Those only grow in the summer months, July, August, typically. And again, with those, there's such a short-lived species. They'll pop up in like mid-morning to early afternoon, and after 8 hours they are completely dead and all traces of them gone. They pop up and only live about 8 hours at the most. So again, a guidebook will tell you species by species, in particular what the growing season is for each, but in general, overall, the window for fungi is beginning of April through the end of October. Are there any questions on that? On anything so far? Okay. Yeah.
How do freeze cycles affect the fungi?
How do what cycles?
Freezing, like freeze cycles.
That's a great question, and I do not know.
No,
I am
me.
not sure how susceptible they are to like fall freezes and frosts and so on. I honestly do not know.
And anything
can-
about like how that cycle goes when they've gone, I guess if they have dormant periods or the
I
ones that
do,
I see turn dry, they look kind of like dried out.
I do not know, and I will definitely look into that and have an answer for next week.
Thanks, very interesting.
Let me write that down here. I'll have an answer for next week. Anybody else? Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of the presentation. And like we said last week, this guy says you can ask questions, but he can't answer because he's a mushroom. And I will stop share at this point. Okay, so anything anybody would like to bring up about the last 2 weeks of presentations? Anything you'd like to discuss? I will just to briefly review. We've talked about fungi, mushrooms. We've talked about roots and rhizomes, bulbs and corms. We've talked about the parts, anatomy of fungi. We've talked about gills versus pores. We talked about polypores. Before this, we've talked about lacquered mushrooms. We've talked about the different species of mushrooms. We did the mushroom drop. And speaking of which, I had really tried to get together, as I had mentioned last week, about trying to have some visual for you from my electric microscope to have projected onto the computer from it some of the pores, or excuse me, spores from last week, and I just was not able to figure out how to get this thing to work. Excuse me. What I actually would like to try to do, because I've got this thing going in a way, I want to try and turn the computer around and see if I can get this to at least show. I will mention that if anybody is ever interested in this, I found on Amazon this digital electronic microscope last year by a company called Moysuwe, Moysuwe. And the price fluctuates on these. I paid, I think, $97 for mine, but it is a digital electric microscope, which magnifies to 1200 power. And you can hook it up to your computer, but the cool thing about it is it has a 7-inch HD viewing screen. And, I do the stream quality monitoring for ODNR in the summer, and this thing has really come in super handy for correct identification of macroinvertebrates out in the field, because the thing has a USB rechargeable battery built into it. And when we had the Brood X cicadas, I used it a lot to study cicadas. under, and I've used it to study insects and all kinds of things. It really gives a good quality image. And for that price, if you do a lot of that type of thing, it really is worth it. And I'm gonna turn this on and turn the computer around, and I'm gonna see if I can try to get you to see a magnification of a pore like that. I don't know if this is going to work or not. So that you can see it.
You might want to cut the background off. That might be interfering with it also.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right about that. After I get done dropping my roller ball and the ball rolls across the floor and I don't know where it went. Oh, nothing's ever easy, right? Oh, here it is. Let's see. Bear with me here.